Thank you, Mike, for those kind words. I'm a bit overwhelmed here. I'm really pleased that all of you came out to hear my talk. I'm terribly honored. I'm especially pleased with all the former students who have come, especially to hear my talk. I haven't seen many of you in many years. It's really quite emotional for me. Mike, you put together a symposium that was just really terrific. I feel a little bit like a driver driving down an icy road in winter and suddenly finding I'm skidding out of control, and my life flashes before my eyes. Fortunately, the results of that are a little more pleasant in the sense that I feel like in the last couple of hours that my career has flashed before my eyes. And I'm reminded of a lot of things that many of which I've forgotten about over the years, but it's a little overwhelming for me. But anyway, let me get right on here with the talk that I'm going to give. And is my pigeon flying across? That's a signal for me to get started. Okay, so many of us have been looking at comparative cognition with the goal of investigating the degree to which other animals have cognitive abilities that have normally been attributed solely to humans or to higher primates, perhaps, in general. Things like imitative learning, transitive inference, stimulus equivalence. Many of these things you've heard about today. For the last few years, though, we have been particularly interested in a different view of this, and a couple of these talks in the symposium reflect this, and earlier talks. Do other animals have biases and suboptimal behavior that are shown by humans? And this was instigated in part by talking to social psychologists who claim that humans are very different because they sometimes behave suboptimally. And animals shouldn't do that. And they shouldn't do that because the way humans misbehave is due to, depending on who you talk to, if it's economists, they'll say insufficient information. Because humans do things like gambling because they don't understand probabilities. This belies the fact that most people say they gamble because it's fun, but that also seems to be inappropriate for animals because their lives depend on being efficient in getting maximum amount of reinforcement. So the challenge was there. Every time I talk to social psychologists, I'm reminded of those challenges that challenge us to find ways in which our animals, an animal as relatively simple as a pigeon is to humans, and the goal, in a sense, is to show social psychologists that maybe they need to rethink some of the complex conceptual problems that the ways they interpret, the mechanisms by which they explain the complexity of human behavior. If pigeons show it, maybe we need to rethink those things. So this is a sort of rational explanation that economists give, but psychologists, Kahneman and Tversky, for example, who I think did some pioneering work in this area, have shown that humans have biases and they sometimes choose suboptimally. And the question is, to what extent are these biases true of other animals? And if so, then they have some basic behavioral origins. So I'm going to talk about 3 of these today. We'll look at a couple more. Cognitive dissonance, or the more tractable version of this justification of effort. Sunk cost, which is the inappropriate persistence that humans sometimes give to tasks. And finally, gambling, and you've heard some of that both in Jennifer's early talk and in Alex's very nice presentation. Games of chance, in which the return is generally less than the output or the investment. So let's start with cognitive dissonance. This was actually a challenge from social psychologists who claimed that humans are the only ones who show cognitive dissonance. For those of you who aren't teaching introductory psychology, cognitive dissonance is sometimes defined as the discomfort that comes from the discrepancy between beliefs and behavior. A lot of the original work was done by Festinger. A more tractable version of this is the justification of effort effect by Aronson and Mills about the same time. And the idea is that rewards are valued more when greater effort is required to obtain them. This is a phenomenon that you can see easily in humans, although it's probably more complicated than it seems. An example that I give to my students is an A in organic chemistry is typically viewed as being worth more than an A in an introduction to golf. They count the same for a grade point average, but in fact, they're really not the same. They're not the same in terms of the kinds of social reinforcement that comes along with having taken a difficult class. Wow, you got an A in organic chemistry. And if you're applying to medical school, they certainly don't count the same. In fact, when dealing with this phenomenon in humans, it's really extremely difficult to isolate the actual rewards. And the reason is, it's usually a fairly reliable rule of thumb to make the assumption that any reward that's difficult to obtain is worth more. If you don't have all the information, that's not a bad decision rule to go by. And so, if you do make that mistake, it seems quite appropriate, especially in the absence of total information. But it can be easily studied in animals under asocial situation, an animal by itself, and under conditions where you can carefully control the magnitude of reinforcement, delay of reinforcement, and that sort of thing. Okay, so heuristics often work with humans. All right, so here's a little test for you, if you've been paying attention. Let's say we turn on a red light on some trial. The pigeon pecks once, and food appears. On other trials, a green light appears, the pigeon has to peck 20 times, and food appears. If we now give the pigeon a choice between red and green, what does the pigeon choose? Red or green?
Red. Red.
Red? Anybody say green?
Yeah, green.
Green?
Green.
Red. Red's the answer. In fact, this was one of the early control procedures we ran when a reviewer said, well, pigeons really like to peck. That's what they do for a living. They like to peck. So we had to run this control. Every pigeon prefers red. These are all counterbalanced by, all of our colors are counterbalanced, by the way. And 100% of the time, once they get a little experience with it. Okay, now, I'll make the problem a little harder. Now that I've sucked you into this. On some trials, or all trials, we have a white light that comes on. On some trials, the pigeon pecks once. It leads to a red stimulus. Let's say the pigeon pecks it once and gets fed. On other trials, the same white light comes on, but one peck is not enough. Now the pigeon has to peck and peck and peck and peck 20 times. A green light comes on. A single peck provides food. And then on some trials, after a considerable amount of training, Peter can verify this, we get a choice between red and green. And the question is, now what does the pigeon choose?
Green.
Green, okay. You set up for this, all right. Traditional learning theory says the pigeon shouldn't care. That is, what should be important is the effort that goes into the stimulus, not what came before it. It shouldn't matter what came before it. The consequence, which is food, it's exactly the same food, same feeder in the same place, and without a delay, and therefore there shouldn't be a difference. That wouldn't be very interesting. So an alternative, which actually, if you didn't know the title of this line of research, you might predict, in fact, some of my colleagues predicted. There, you might think of easy trials and hard trials, or good trials and bad trials. And if you did that, you would say, well, the red trials are, they're not signaled really, it's, think of it as a sort of a backward association or a contextual cue, if you will. The red trials are associated with good trials, the green is associated with the poorer trials, so they might prefer the red. and one might predict that. And then there's a more interesting justification of effort, which is, gee, I've worked so hard for that green, it must be worth more, otherwise I wouldn't have worked so hard for it. That's the justification of effort hypothesis. Okay, well, it turns out that when we ran a pilot study, you know what a pilot study is? It's a real study that didn't work out, as they call it. So we discovered that the latency of choice response was extremely short. It was as if the pigeon just pecked the first thing it saw. Pigeons are not always, don't always choose appropriately when they have to choose for the first time. And so we thought, well, we'll slow the pigeon down a little bit so it can't peck the first thing it sees on training trials. So now the pigeon has to look carefully for the red. The red is still the correct one. Yellow is always incorrect. It's a very simple simultaneous discrimination, green and blue as well. But now the pigeon has to look for the one that's correct. And so when we give the pigeon a choice, then it's familiar with the idea of choosing between two stimuli. And so now we can look at the procedure when we've slowed the animal down a bit. And now, in fact, we do get a preference for green over red. And in much of the research that we've done, that preference is about the same in many experiments. It's about 2/3 of the time the pigeon prefers the stimulus that it had to work harder for than the stimulus that was easier to obtain. Okay, so the next question is, do we want to explain this in terms of cognitive dissonance? Is it cognitive dissonance or justification of effort, or is there a simpler explanation? Simpler. It's not necessarily simple, but it's simpler. And the notion, the explanation that we came up with was contrast. And the contrast is between the negative value of effort, or other things, and the positive value of reinforcement, or in this case, the signal for reinforcement. So you can think of it in anthropomorphic terms as the animal is pecking and getting frustrated and tired, and suddenly the green comes on, and it's relief, if you will. Okay, so we have a very simplistic kind of model to describe this. At the beginning of each trial, we'll call the relative value of the beginning of the trial 0. We'll just set it at 0. We'll set reinforcement at some absolute value relative to 0, and then we'll describe pecking. On the easy trials, there's a single peck, and that's the relative value to the animal of the signal for reinforcement over the reinforcer. And then on 20 peck trials, the animal is in a more negative state, if you will, or emotional state, I don't know, whatever you want to label it, doesn't really matter. And so this is the value, the relative value. There's a contrast between the state of the animal just before the color appears and when the color appears. That's the model. The interesting thing about this model is that it doesn't describe what causes the animal to get into that state, and that allows for some interesting predictions. Oh, this is a reminder, Alex did some very nice research with Starlings at about the same time, and we were at a conference, in fact, where we talked about this research, and I was really interested that we used these Starlings, and they're flying back and forth from one end of the cage to the other, and on some trials they had to do it 16 times to obtain a white light, and other times 4 times to obtain an orange light, and he found that they preferred the white over the orange. Very nice, in parallel, just similar kinds of ideas as Alex said earlier. Okay, so the question we raised then, because the model wasn't really specific about the nature of the, call it the aversive event, relatively aversive event, so we asked, can other aversive events substitute for effort? And the one that's most obviously confounded with effort in that early experiment is delay to reinforcement. And in fact, it's very interesting because Ed Fantino has suggested that pecking is not what's aversive whenever an animal has a choice. It's the delay to reinforcement that causes the animal to prefer not pecking a lot to pecking a little. So we could look at the same procedure. In this case, we signaled the event that was to follow. So on some trials, the pigeon has to peck a vertical line 5 times. Immediately, it gets red versus yellow, with red correct and gets fed. And on other trials, it has a horizontal line, and 5 pecks are required, but now there's a 6-second delay. And then green versus blue. Otherwise, the design is exactly the same as before. And then we simply ask, which does the animal prefer, red or green? And the answer, of course, is green. And again, about 2/3 of the time, the animal prefers that. So we're on a roll. We figure, what else can we present the animal with that might be considered relatively aversive? Well, how about the absence of reinforcement when on other trials reinforcement occurs? That would be relatively aversive to the animal. So we have a very similar design. On some trials, we have a vertical line. That 5 pecks produces food. That's the easy trial, the positive, relatively appetitive event that occurs. Then we get a choice between red and yellow. In other trials, we have a horizontal line, again 5 pecks, and we get the food that follows it. We're controlling now for time between the beginning of the trial and the discrimination. And now we have green versus blue. And the question is, does the pigeon prefer the stimulus that was preceded by the absence of food, or the stimulus that was preceded by food? And of course, the answer is the animal prefers green about 2/3 of the time. About this time, I was talking to some behavioral ecologists, and unlike Alex, there are a number of behavioral ecologists who, the first question they ask is, why would an animal do that? And if you're taking the animal and bringing it into the laboratory, you're creating artificial situations, and you can't interpret the animal's behavior sometimes. And so we thought, I really don't mind that kind of question, because it's a challenge to me to come up with a model. Some behavioral ecologists are satisfied with the answers that I give, which are hypotheticals, and I find that a little irritating, but I try to explain it, and then I try to study it if I can. So it's a good stimulus for me. Oh, I'm sorry, greater hunger. Alex did some very nice work, Peter as well, on another reversive event. Here you have to make the animal hungry one day and not so hungry the next day. And in their work, Alex's work and also Peter's work, shows that you can get the same effect. So if an animal, a pigeon or a starling or a grasshopper even, right? Grasshoppers. If the animal is hungry and then gets fed on one day, and if it's not so hungry and gets fed on the next day, it will tend to prefer the food or the stimulus that is associated with being hungrier, and that occurs whether the animal on test trials is hungry or not, which is more impressive than just the state-dependent effect. This occurs, food tastes much better when you're hungry, but when you prefer that kind of food, that's the question, and in both labs they show that that's true. Okay, so getting back to my question about what might be in the real world that would correspond to this effect. So my answer was, well, let's say the animal has to forage for food, and one day it finds food relatively close to its home, and then the next day it has to wander quite far from its home, and it might appreciate the food that it had to go farther from home to obtain. And they said, okay, that sounds reasonable, because perhaps that would encourage the animal to continue foraging further when resources are scarce. They seemed satisfied with that. I was a little horrified by that. That is, I just made that up. How can you be satisfied with that? A psychologist would say, show me. Would say, do it. And of course, it's very hard to do in nature, because you can't move those things around and show that that food that it found under the bush half a mile away is preferred over the food that it found really close hand. But in the laboratory, you can study this. So the location of food, so we modified an operant panel. We have 3 keys. We have 2 feeders. The feeders are identical. And what we're going to do is manipulate what it takes the animal to get food from the particular feeder. Now it turns out we assumed that there wouldn't be any preference in feeders, but pigeons in fact do have fairly strong preferences. You have to know something about the typical operant box, where the panel is on the right side and the door is on the animal's right side. So some animals prefer to stand at the back and side back relative to the door, and some animals close to the door, depending on how assertive they are. I don't know. Some animals can be fairly aggressive, and some animals can be fairly shy. Anyway, I think it's correlated with that. Fortunately, it was not a particular feeder that the animals preferred. And so the first thing we did was to test the animal's feeder preference. And so we did this we didn't have photo beams at the time. So we just lit the key above the feeder. And when the pigeon pecked the key, it got the food from that feeder. And on other trials, it got another key, and it had to peck that key to get the feeder below it. And then we could ask the animal which feeder did it prefer. So it told us which feeder it preferred, and they were fairly strong preferences. Once we got the preferences, we discovered the preferences, we turned on a yellow light in the middle of the center key. And on some trials, one peck was sufficient to turn it off and raise a feeder, and it always raised the more preferred feeder. All right, so one peck raised the more preferred feeder, and then we required on other trials the animal to peck 30 times to raise the less preferred feeder. So we're working against ourselves in part so that we can see a change in preference over time. Okay, so we got smart at this point. About this point, Peter was telling me, you know, I can't replicate your original results. And this was a little disconcerting. And we realized that we had run a fixed number of sessions until we tested the animals, and that we may have gotten very lucky. And so we decided to change our procedure slightly. And so what we did was in this experiment, we inserted these test trials, 8 trials every session, so we could monitor the preferences in these probe trials to see how that preference was changing. And it turns out that it does require a considerable amount of training to get this effect. And here's the effect that we observed. So this is preference for the less preferred feeder, and you can see the less preferred feeder is not preferred very much, but in blocks of 64 test trials, there are 8, so that's 8 times 9, 72 sessions of training before they get up there. And you can see there's a fairly regular improvement or switch in preference from the less preferred towards the more preferred feeder. Now, the problem is that maybe just with a lot of experience, they recognize that the feeders really aren't so different after all. And so we had a control group, and the control group got uncorrelated presentations. So some trials 1 peck, some trials 30 pecks, but they got the left and right feeder that are uncorrelated with the number of pecks. And let's see. There we go. And so those are the open circles represent the control, and they bounced around a bit, but they essentially maintained their original preference. That's the dotted line shows that. Okay, so we thought one of the problems with translating tasks that have been done with humans into research with animals is we often modify the task so that it makes it simpler. And it would be nice to know if we could get this effect in humans. We started out with young humans because they're closer to pigeons than older humans. And so we actually did this study with French children when I was in fellowship in France, but French children are just as smart as children. And so we did this on a computer screen with mouse clicks. So instead of a key peck, it was a mouse. And 1 click to red stimulus produced, we used shapes, in part because we didn't want the discrimination to be too easy, partly because we wanted to maintain the children's attention, because we knew that it would take quite a bit of training, and if they could just label it what was the red stimulus or yellow stimulus that's correct, we thought that they might get bored with the task. So we gave them shapes that we thought might be a little difficult for them to discriminate initially. They would take them a little time to discriminate, and then we presented them with a short cartoon video as a reward if they got it right. And then another trial, they had to make 20 clicks, and then they got another pair of shapes for the video. And then, just as before, we gave them a choice between the two positive ones that were associated with the video. And sure enough, we got preference for the one, and this is all counterbalanced, of course, for the one that had been associated with 20 clicks. And it's in about 2/3 of the time we prefer that. Came back to the States, decided to be courageous, try our undergraduates at the University of Kentucky, and made it a little more complicated. So instead of just 2 pairs, we actually used 4 pairs of stimuli to make it a little bit more challenging, and gave them very basic instructions to try to get as many points as they possibly could. And then, the other thing we could do, which we discovered with college students, is you really can't run multiple trials with the same stimulant. And we discovered this after the fact because the first few subjects we ran, we found there was a negative correlation between the first trial with a pair of stimuli and the second trial with the same pair of stimuli. And when we asked the subjects, they said, well, they tried one. They thought they were both correct. They tried one, and that didn't seem to produce. We told them they weren't going to get any feedback, and that didn't do anything. So they thought, well, I'll try the other one and see what happens there. So, but with 4 pairs of them, we can get. You can see that you can get 4 different pairings of the stimuli, and you get a little more data at least without having to run more than one pair, one trial per pair. And we looked at the data, and of course they preferred the 2 stimuli that have been associated with 20 clicks. And with adults now, you can ask them what the basis of the choice was, and some of our subjects got particularly annoyed because while they, at the time when they were getting these test trials, some of them noted that they were both positive, and how should they choose? And we told them, well, do the best you can. It's what we usually do with human subjects. And then when we asked them how they chose, they get annoyed because they said, look, you told me to choose. I told you they were both correct. You told me to choose, and I chose. I don't know. I just guessed. That's all I did. I was guessing. Well, yeah, leave me alone. And so look, 2/3 of the time. And now they all said, sometimes I have to click a lot and sometimes I didn't, but I don't remember which ones came up, which is nice because it suggests that in general, there was a lack of awareness of this relationship. So you can think of this as a Pavlovian association. There's no need for them to remember or to pay attention to the relationship between the effort that goes into the initial link and the discrimination that follows it. So that was interesting. So, justification of effort appears to occur in pigeons as well as in humans, but it's very unlikely that cognitive dissonance is needed to account for this effect in pigeons. So we prefer a simpler account based on a kind of contrast effect. It's not totally simple because it's not obvious why there should be necessarily contrast, but it's certainly a lot simpler than cognitive dissonance. So we think it's this contrast between how the individual feels in an anthropomorphic sense at the end of the effort or whatever it occurs. There's some negative feeling associated with the event, and then when the stimulus appears, it's reinforcing, a signal for reinforcement. And so in humans, you might refer to this as relief, and the implication is to what extent could contrast be involved in humans to show similar effects. And I think with a lot of complex behavior in humans, there are very likely to be simpler mechanisms involved, and that's not to say that we don't have this overlay of culture, of learning, that reinforces some of these basic principles. It's just that the basis for them is quite probably a lot simpler. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is the sunk cost dilemma, or the Concord Effect. And the phenomenon in humans is we sometimes have a tendency to persist in tasks, even when there's no chance of success. This happens most often in small businesses when people are told they've decided to start a restaurant, and it's been going for 6 months and been losing money all of the 6 months. They're just not getting people to come in. and everyone, including economists, are telling them they ought to quit before they get further behind, and they say, well, just let me go for another 3 months or another 6 months, it's going to turn around. It's sometimes, so loss aversion. It's sometimes called the Concord Effect because that infamous SST that the British and French collaborated on that flew for a while and then they phased it out because of its accidents, a number of accidents that happened. But they were told when they were building this, long before it was completed, that there was no way that it could make any money. They would lose money on it no matter how successful it was, and it wasn't terribly successful. And they decided to continue building it. Now, one could argue that there are other reasons for building it rather than making money, but in part, that's a good example of the phenomenon itself, that we don't like to admit that we've lost all that money. The problem is that they've already lost all that money, and there's no way of recouping it. So, another good example that you might have encountered, you go to New York to see a Broadway show. I'm guessing that they're actually more expensive now than when I put that up, $100 to see a Broadway show. At intermission, you realize it's boring. This could be to a movie. It might not be quite the same investment. And the question is, do you want to continue seeing it, or do you want to walk out on it? And people often say leaving would be a waste of money. And so the problem is, well, we've been taught not to waste, but the money is wasted in either case. And if you stay, you're wasting additional time. And so this is a case of, I would say, the inappropriate use of resources. And so we tend to continue with the task inappropriately. Economists say that costs that have already been incurred and cannot be recovered should not enter into decisions to continue. That is, you should base your decisions solely on the future. If you think there'll be a positive outcome, if you're convinced that there will be, that's fine, but you shouldn't base it on the amount you've already invested or lost. There shouldn't be this sort of loss aversion that causes you to try to recoup your losses. So, we might almost show the sunk cost effect, and there have been a number of studies that have looked at it in ways that actually, I would say, probably better mimic the kinds of decisions that humans make than what we've done. But the problem is that in most real-life decisions, the outcome is almost always probabilistic. And so one can easily convince oneself, in the case of a restaurant, for example, that, gee, if you do keep at it for another 3 months, maybe it will turn around. You don't know for sure. These economists are probably quoting you a probabilistic outcome. They'll say, well, in this case, 90% of the time, the restaurants fail. And you say, well, maybe I'll be the 10%. So we decided to study this under conditions where the outcomes were not probabilistic. Okay, this is research that Christina Patterson and Shige Watanabe and I collaborated on. Phase 1, we're going to train pigeons that green means 30 pecks for food and red means 10 pecks for food. So we confounded this, by the way, with spatial location to facilitate acquisition. It probably doesn't matter, but so the green light comes on the left, it takes 30 pecks to provide reinforcement. The red light comes on the right, and it takes 10 pecks to provide reinforcement. That's phase 1. That's just to make sure that the animals have discriminated between the two, and then we can give the animal a choice between the two. And if you remember from one of my first slides, the pigeons will always choose the red light, and they do. So we're convinced that the animals understand the difference between red and green. And now what we're going to do is break up the 30 pecks into chunks. And so we're going to train the pigeon that pecks to green may be interrupted, and they can either complete the required pecks, whatever, pick up where they left off, or they can switch to the red and make 10 pecks. Now, if you think about this, if you just turn on the red light at some point, the pigeon may not even notice that the red light has come on. The pigeon, in order to switch, the pigeon has to incur a short delay. So we wanted to avoid that sort of interpretation. So what we did was to train the pigeon on forced trials to make a certain number of pecks, between 10 and 20 pecks, and then the green light goes off and a white light comes on. That gets the pigeon between the two, so that there's the tendency to go either way could be at least controlled for the time it would take and the distance taken. And then on some of these forced trials, the pigeon would have the green light come back on again after that one peck, and the pigeon would make the remaining pecks. If it was 20 pecks already made, then you'd have to make 10 pecks. If it was 10 pecks already made, 20 pecks, and some in between. And on other trials where the pigeon had made between 10 and 20 pecks, it would peck the white light, and then the red light would come on. So it learns the contingencies associated with returning to the green light or switching to the red light. And then on critical trials, we have the green light come on, a white light, and then a choice between the two. Okay? Straightforward. The difference between this and a probabilistic outcome is the pigeon should be able to learn that if it continues pecking the green light, it's going to have to make somewhere between 10 and 20 pecks, whereas if it switches to the red light, it will always only have to make 10 pecks. Okay? Now, here we have percentage of choices to stay with the green, as a function of the pecks remaining if the choice is to stay, and always the pecks of choice. All right, so this red line down here indicates what should be optimal, because clearly well, we've trained the pigeon that if there are 30 pecks to green, then, and only 10 pecks to red, then you should always switch. If there are 20 pecks to green, if there are 20 pecks remaining, you should still switch. If there are 15 pecks versus 10, you should switch. And if there are 10 pecks where it's equal, then you could do anything, but the simplest rule would be always switch. Because if it's 10 and 10, it doesn't really matter. And you've already seen this, and you can see that if it's 30 versus 10, all the pigeons switch, which we trained them to do. But anything other than that, if it's 20 versus 10, all the pigeons will tend to stay to some extent, more than 50%. Two of them quite a bit. This is 4 pigeons, and 2 not so much. But if it's 15 versus 10, they all stay, and of course at 10 versus 10, they all stay all the time. So rather convincing that even if it's not probabilistic, that they will tend to go back to what they are used to doing, essentially, tend to stay. Okay, so could it be that the pigeon just prefer the variable number of pecks associated with the green alternative? So we tested this in 2 different ways. One of them was to simply not have an initial investment. And so we give them a choice between a variable number of pecks and a fixed number of pecks. And it turns out that after they've had the training that we gave them, they initially prefer to stay. But over time, they prefer to switch. So, and the other procedure is we have random investment, so it's not correlated with what they have to do, and then they do the appropriate thing also. So it's not just the variability that seems to be driving this, but it's the tendency to go back to what you know, even though they've been given an equal number of forced experiences with switching and staying. So they certainly learn those contingencies, or they should. Okay, so economists tell us to avoid some costs. Future decisions to continue should not be affected by the amount of prior losses, and the only relevant information is future probability of success. Humans often show us some cost effect. Pigeons show the same effect. They overvalue staying, and then the sunk cost effect does not seem to depend on a learned tendency to avoid wasting resources. This cultural phenomenon that parents always tell you, stick to the task, follow through, don't quit, all of these things that very often are the interpretation of this effect when it occurs in humans. Clearly that can't be the case with animals, and so I suspect that there is some other kind of basic biological phenomenon going on here. Okay, the third example is suboptimal choice by pigeons. You've already heard a couple of presentations, one by Jennifer, one by Alex, on this suboptimal choice task. a model of human gambling behavior. Sometimes I ask, would a pigeon buy a lottery ticket? Apparently, a pigeon would. We give a pigeon a choice between a risky alternative and a safe alternative, and you've seen this design before, so I'll just go over it very quickly. The pigeon has a 20% chance on the risky side of getting 10 pellets of food. The jackpot, or an 80% chance of getting 0 pellets, which is a loss. On the other side, we're just counterbalancing for probabilities of colors, and it just gets a little more complicated, but the important thing is they always get 3 pellets. Always get 3 pellets. So the pellets expected on the right is 3, the pellets expected on the left is an average of 2, and so with a lot of experience, one would expect the pigeon to have the no gamble side, and that's not what happens. In this experiment, 87% of the time, there was a preference for the side with the discriminative stimuli or the risky alternative. We've done this in a number of different ways. We can manipulate the probability of reinforcement, as Alex did. Give the pigeon a choice to gamble or not gamble. In this case, a little different. There's a 20% probability of getting fed, so we're not manipulating magnitude of reinforcement, just probability of reinforcement associated with that alternative. The Q, the green light, says there's a 100% chance of getting fed, and the red light says there's no chance of getting fed. On the non-gambling side, if you will, there's a 50% chance of getting fed, regardless of what the color is. So we're not discriminating between the two colors, but as you can see at the top, it says 20% chance of reinforcement. I get this right there. 20% chance of reinforcement on this side, 2.5 times as much food on this side, but in fact, the pigeons prefer an even stronger preference for the discriminative stimulus alternative. And so this is a very powerful effect, and it occurs under these conditions very quickly. I don't have the acquisition functions. In a minute I'll show you some where we can slow it down because we're interested in what the mechanisms are. So it appears that the jackpot trials have a more positive value than they should have. They only occur 20% of the time, but they seem to drive this whole effect. And the question we raised is, why doesn't the experience with 80% losses deter the pigeon? And Alex suggested why that might be, that it just doesn't have much of an effect for them, the absence of reinforcement. Even though on other trials they do get fed, it seems to not have the negative effect on behavior that it ought to have. And so we approach this from the perspective of psychologists, or learning psychologists. Condition inhibitors appear to have less negative value than they ought to have. So there's a question of whether we could show this. Is there any way of demonstrating that losses play a minimal role, less of a role than they ought to have? So we used a combined Q test. This is something that comes out of the operant literature. If we want to know about the inhibitory value of a stimulus that's not associated with reinforcement, you can't really look at pecking to it, because when pigeons don't peck at it, they could be ignoring it, they could perhaps not care about it. So what you can do is superimpose an S- stimulus on a known S+ stimulus and see what effect it has. And you would expect that it would decrease responding. That's been shown in the literature, that relative to the S+ by itself, you get decreased responding to the combined Q. So that's what we're going to do. There's our original procedure, but of course if we take that S- stimulus and we superimpose it on that, we get a kind of muddy color. So instead we do what Jennifer suggested. Pigeons will peck at all but the red stimulus to assess inhibition. We already talked about that. So here's what we do. Jennifer showed that. And now what we can do is ask, what is the effect of superimposing that vertical line on the green stimulus? And what we're going to do now is superimpose it early, when presumably they haven't learned a lot about it, and late when presumably they've learned a lot about it. And in fact, what you would expect is early there would be less inhibition than late. That's the hypothesis we're testing. But really what we're going to be looking at is just the opposite. And you may notice here we've changed the outcome here. So we've actually raised this from 50% to 75%, and we've made the probability of the 100% stimulus 0.5. We found in earlier research that this actually slows down the animal's tendency to choose the gambling alternative, which is somewhat paradoxical in a sense. we raise the probability of getting that jackpot, we actually lower the attractiveness of that jackpot. In a sense, in a Pavlovian sense, it's a better predictor. The green stimulus is a better predictor of reinforcement when it has a low probability of occurring, but it has a high probability of success. Well, anyway, we can see from this acquisition function something very interesting. Initially, they start out at 50%. They haven't learned anything. Before they actually learn those values of the stimuli that follow the effort, they actually seem to be learning something about the overall probability of the two alternatives. And you can see this is the percentage of suboptimal choice. So they're actually choosing optimally for a number of sessions, which is what we were looking for, so we could look at inhibition at that point. And then, of course, they just shoot up, as you can see, over time, number of sessions. And those bars indicated when we assessed the inhibitory value of that vertical line. And what we're going to do is just plot responses to the compound divided by responses to the S plus by itself. And we're going to do this early. And early on, we find, so if there's no effect, if they respond just as much to the compound, you would expect a ratio of compound to the S plus to be up at 1. And you can see it decreased by about 40%. That's the inhibitory value, essentially, of the vertical line. And but late, you can see that the inhibitory value is reduced by about 1/2. Even though that's a lot more experience with all those non-reinforced trials associated with the vertical line. So it seems like the more experience you have with losing, the less of an effect losing has on you. You can think of this in, again, anthropomorphic terms. And gamblers report this, by the way, that when they gamble and lose, they expect it to lose anyway, and so it doesn't have much of an effect on their behavior. It seems to be that attraction of the possibility of winning that seems to be the important thing. So just like humans with experience, pigeons tend to undervalue losses. And if the probability of a loss is not very important, then the value of a win must be the only important outcome. The value of a win, the probability of losing is not important, therefore the probability of winning is also not important. And that's something else that Alex was pointing out in his very good talk. So it's the value and not the probability. And gamblers seem to be very susceptible to this problem as well. They don't seem to be very sensitive to the probability of a win. People buy lottery tickets where the probability is 1,000,000 to 1, and yet it's the value, it's those millions of dollars that you might win, even though the probability is very low. Okay, so what that means now, it's not that it's 2 pellets versus 3 pellets, rather it's 10 pellets versus 3 pellets. Now that's not the real probability, that's not the real outcome, but that's what the animals seem to be judging. It's the outcome of the stimulus associated with the jackpot, if you will. And the same is true if there's a 20% chance of getting green. That's not the probability that's important. It's the probability that green will lead to food. And so it's 100% versus 50%. It's the basis for the decision. And now in the case where we're measuring inhibition, this becomes a lot clearer why acquisition was so slow. It's not 50% versus 75%. It's actually 100% versus 75%. And that discrimination is quite a bit harder to make for the pigeons. And so it takes them a while to learn that. And that's why they acquire it slowly. Okay, so the question then is, what happens if we test this hypothesis in, I would say, the most extreme form, which is, what if we give the pigeons discriminative stimuli on both sides, but on one side, the probability of getting the positive stimulus that's associated with 100% reinforcement is much greater. So let's go back to 20% reinforcement. Here, 20% reinforcement, but the green stimulus associated with 100% reinforcement. 20% of the time that's a green stimulus. But then on the other side, rather than the non-gambling side, we're going to ask the animal, what about if you've got a 50-50 chance of getting blue or yellow, but they're discriminative stimuli. So there's 100% reinforcement associated with blue. But now, if we look at the payoff for choosing to gamble on the left versus gamble on the right, it's twice, the probability is you get 2.5 times as much food for responding on the right than responding on the left. And so pigeons should be sensitive to that. And so they should prefer the right side. But if we're correct that all they care about is getting a blue stimulus or getting a green stimulus, because those two stimuli are associated with the same probability of reinforcement, then the pigeons might be indifferent. And that's exactly what we get. Our pigeons don't seem to care. That's 20 sessions of training, which is plenty. Usually within 10 sessions we get, they choose the discriminative stimuli. Now they're discriminative stimuli on both sides, but the probability of reinforcement is vastly different between the two. Okay, so probability of reinforcement is not important, and we suspect the same is true of human gamblers. If animals show suboptimal choice similar to that of humans, it suggests this behavior does not result from culture, and that's sort of the important reasons for why we do this research is because we're trying to show that it has implications for human behavior. Justification of effort does not seem to be to result from justifying one's effort to ourselves or to others. If this is correct, it seems to be just a natural phenomenon that occurs whenever we have a shift from some context in which it's effortful or the delay of reinforcement or anything like that to a context in which we get reinforcement occurring. Some cost does not seem to derive from don't waste or finish what you started, although very often culture reinforces these sort of basic predispositions that we have. And gambling, it may be fun to gamble, but I don't think that's the basis for gambling behavior. I think that and I often tell people, would you gamble if money wasn't involved? They say it's not for the money, it's for fun, but typically they won't gamble if money's not involved. So that's a really interesting question to ask people about the fun of gambling. Okay, so the question that I often get by people who work with animals is if animals show up suboptimal choice, maybe it had adaptive value in nature. And this is where I start waving my arms, of course, but I'm asked these questions, and so I speculate. I'm willing to go out on a limb, I guess. So what is the reason? Why do animals show justification of effort effects? Because it may provide added motivation to continue when resources are scarce. So if food is available wherever you find it, it's good. But if you have to forage far from home for food, or it's very difficult, maybe you should value it more because that will allow you to continue or encourage you further to continue looking for food rather than giving up. Alex may have something to say about this. Some costs. Alternative options are often inherently risky. So it's sort of the devil you know, you can go back to it. This is a natural tendency, especially in prey animals like pigeons. Novelty, they tend to be averse. The problem is that they have lots of experience with that red stimulus. It's just that immediately they've been responding to the green one, and so that it is a tendency to go back to that green one. And then in nature, attraction to stimuli that predict high-value outcomes typically increases the probability of obtaining them. This is my explanation for why it is that animals and humans tend to gamble. And my favorite example is in most human endeavors, when you are trying to improve your lot, improve your skills, you usually, as you gain experience with it, you actually change those probabilities. In this case, having lots of experience with gambling doesn't change the probabilities. They're always probabilistic. This is in cases where chance is an important thing. If there's skills involved, like poker, clearly that will change the probabilities. But in most gambling, the more lottery tickets you buy, it's just you're incrementing your chances of winning and losing, but the same amount. It doesn't change the probabilities. And so I think what happens is that we click into this natural tendency that in other areas, when we as we practice, if you practice shooting a basketball, you get better and better at it, and therefore it encourages people, I think, to do that. Okay, so the bottom line is that heuristics that have had adaptive value in nature may no longer have adaptive value in our modern culture, and I think casinos and the people who run lotteries have discovered this. I don't know that they necessarily know about the mechanisms that control it, but they've discovered that people are willing to spend their money on these things, and they can make a lot of money by encouraging people to gamble. So the bottom line here in terms of trying to alter people's behaviors, we recognize that such suboptimal behavior may have originated from basic behavioral processes, and maybe we can resist those natural tendencies a little bit better using our sort of cognitive mechanisms to overrule them. And finally, I want to thank all of my collaborators, my students who have led to this research. Very often it's been ideas from students that have allowed this research to progress. I am greatly indebted to them for all their help, not just in running experiments, but in discussing the ideas behind these experiments. Without them, I don't think I could have done any of the research that's been mentioned in the last 3 hours or so. Thank you very much.
Studies where you put together the two that had been reinforced and looked for a preference. Did you ever, by any quirky possibility, put the two negatives together to see? I mean, it's a forced choice.
Yeah.
What did they do?
They prefer the one that went with the one that the negative that went with the positive that they prefer.
Okay.
Quite strongly, in fact. A little stronger than they prefer the positive, like maybe 80%. And that's a completely, I didn't want to mention that just because I think the mechanism is different. It's value transfer, I think. Mm-hmm. That is, there is value that transfers from the positive stimulus to the negative, and I think that's a Pavlovian association. It's simply that when they don't respond to the negative stimulus, if it's the first thing they see, it means that the one on the other side, whichever side they're not on, is the one that they like. Mm-hmm. And so it's a second order conditioned stimulus, I think.
Well, why should it be stronger
okay.
than the...
Very good question. So imagine yourself sitting in front of two positive stimuli. They're both correct. It's easy to pick the first one you see.
Oh, okay.
But if you're sitting in front of two negative stimuli, you look at this one, you get ready to peck it down. That one's a negative one too. And that one's the latencies are very long on those trials. So I think there's... what would you say, the race to the criterion is a lot slower when you have stimuli that are not associated directly with reinforcement, but only secondarily. Using Alex's model there, the race to criterion. Somebody else back there had a question? Over here? Over there, Stephen.
Tom, turning to your last thought about heuristics being perhaps adaptive, but not in a modern culture. One of the things that economists will tell you is that wherever there is a heuristic, there is an opportunity for somebody else to profit.
Absolutely.
An obvious example is bookmakers.
Yeah.
Within your fields, within something else I've studied at some length is fraud. One of some of the reasons that we fall victim to frauds and scams is that they tap into heuristics. So that would offer a nice explanation of how something that was maybe adaptive in the environment of ecological adaptation or whatever, no longer is in the modern culture. Except that I just wonder whether the same isn't true in the natural economy. So that you could rewrite the economist's rule, that wherever there's an opportunity, wherever there's a heuristic, there's an opportunity for a predator. So the question that comes out of that is, how could a competing species or a predator species exploit the quote-unquote mistakes that your pigeons are making?
Well, we have unnatural predators, casino owners. You're talking about a natural setting for animals. Have to think about that, but I'm sure there are ways of doing that. Did you want to answer that?
Let me just make a very general comment that addresses this problem. What behavioral ecologists do is not really, when they work well, it's not really very different from what Herbert Simon suggested in psychology. That is, if you want to understand the mind, you have to understand the environment, and you have to understand the function that the mind has evolved to do. Why do we have minds? Why do pigeons have minds? They have minds because if they didn't, they would do less well. So you have to actually ask the question, in what kind of environments the mechanisms that we observe are actually advantageous. And it's not really a fair picture to say that when the functional questions are raised, there's the opportunity for hand-waving. There is an opportunity, actually, that is true. But it's not the only thing you can do, and it's not what the better work in behavioral ecology does. Behavioral ecologists use this apparent suboptimality in the laboratory as the raw material for thinking in what kind of universe this would not be suboptimal, and then they model it carefully to try to see whether those conditions do exist. So the question that Steve is asking is very relevant here, and the question is, if an animal has a relatively rigid mechanism, like for example, never peck at something which is brightly colored, this must be because in the normal world, pecking at very brightly colored things is really a bad thing. That applies to
I agree with you completely, and let me say that I should qualify this by saying it's not so much the explanation for why this occurs in nature, but being satisfied with the hand-waving explanation that I made. It should say, well, now we have to go and see if that's accurate. That's what I expected to get from them. So these are maybe not good behavioral ecologists because they just seem to nod their head and say, okay, I'm fine with that. And I consider that a just so story. And I think that's the criticism that's sometimes made, but I think your approach is much better. And that's the way to get at why these things exist in nature and then why we see them so in such an extreme form in the laboratory. And I think the collaboration is the way to get at the mechanisms that underlie the behavior. Absolutely. And I didn't mean to insult you as a behavioral ecologist. Good, thank you. Because I think you're a prime example of individual who wouldn't just accept that explanation. Yes?
Another kind of a thinking about that is, I don't know if you read Kahneman's book, but the System 1, System 2 sort of thing, that he sort of argues that these biases and heuristics are System 1 kind of lower level, and that we can then just kind of engage in those without a lot of effort, and then it means that we're not kind of taxed, and so, I mean, that could be another sort of way of thinking about it. That
Right, so the question is, why do so many people just engage in these System 1 behaviors and not use the System 2? I mean, I go to a casino and, well, first of all, I don't gamble, but even if I did, I would lose $10 and say, that's it. I'm not interested in losing a lot of money. So, why don't these System 2, why doesn't this large brain of ours prevent us from doing things that we know are inappropriate, even if our natural tendencies tell us to do them? Clearly, becoming aware of those things sometimes helps. But, by the way, we've done some of this research, gambling type research. Jennifer mentioned this. We've done it with humans. And as it turns out, she kind of glossed over it a little bit, but it turns out that if you just take a random sample of people, they don't respond suboptimally. You have to get habitual gamblers to do it, and even then, they do so significantly more than either a random sample or individuals who tend not to gamble. It's a large effect, but it's not nearly as big an effect, even with gamblers, as it is with pigeons. But I think that's because pigeons are just a lot more impulsive, and even gamblers are. Yeah.
So to follow up on not, so why not use these additional, this big brain, right? Clearly there's effort involved to apply those kinds of strategies. And the idea being that, let's say you took Texas Hold'em poker players and put them in your suboptimal example, right? I guarantee you if they were any good, they would be taking into account value, expected value, and probability. And so in that sense, would you suspect there would be a way to teach them, right, to perform better in these tasks?
Okay, so I actually mentioned poker players, I think, as examples where skill plays an important role. So I'm really thinking about games that are totally chance. Numbers are random, or slot machines, roulette, I mean, all those things. I spent a week in Las Vegas a couple of months ago just because the family decided to meet there. None of us ever gambled, but we walked through the casinos and watched people just putting money into these slot machines, like automatons. It was really frightening to see the way people were doing this.
They were having fun.
Yeah.
They were having fun, yeah, right. Yeah, they were doing it as if...
Tom, your animals are often dealing with long-term constant probabilities. Much like
Constant?
Yeah, I mean, they're trained up and they're being exposed for a wide period of time.
Yeah, okay.
My question is, what do you think it'd be possible to take your pigeons and turn them into good poker players where the contingencies are probabilities are constantly changing? Would they know when to fold?
We need to talk about that. We'll do it. If you think of a good way to test it.
Well, thank you very much, Tom.
Well, thank you.